Greetings, everyone. My name is Bridget Cabrera, she, her, hers, and I'm the Executive Director of Methodist Federation for Social Action. MFSA is an over 100-year-old faith-based policy and organizing network, and our mission is to mobilize, lead, and sustain a justice-seeking United Methodist movement, energizing people to be agents of God's justice, peace, and reconciliation. We have the pleasure to be co-hosting this series of webinars with our partner, United Methodist for Kairos Response, UMKR. We acknowledge that this land and the many lands that you are joining us from, its history and all the being seen and unseen, known and unknown, as we step into our work on this land, most of us as uninvited guests. We offer this work in the spirit of reparation, devoting ourselves to justice, as we strive to uplift the legacy of all of these places. We invite you to acknowledge the indigenous land of where you are joining us from and type that in the chat. A few announcements concerning our call today. By participating in our webinars, we covenant together to co-create an equitable and brave space where we learn, engage, and grow in relationship together. We are recording this webinar, and that recording will be shared in the coming days, both on MFSA and UMKR's YouTube channels and our websites. As you have questions, you don't have to wait till the Q&A section of our conversation. You can type them in the chat box at any time, and you can direct those questions to me. I show up as Methodist Federation for Social Action. We have closed captioning available. It is automatically generated, so do expect to see probably some spelling errors in that as it is automatically adjusted. I'm pleased to introduce our moderator for our conversation today, Teresa Basile. Teresa is a co-founder of UMKR. She currently serves as Communications Director and Education Co-Chair and works on a variety of programs for UMKR, such as movement building and political advocacy. She has served on the boards of Friends of Sabeel North America and U.S. Campaign for Palestinian Rights. And she has been an activist and organizer for many years in MFSA and in the Western Methodist Justice Movement. Welcome, Teresa.
Thank you, Bridget. It's been a while. It's been longer than usual since our last UMKR MFSA webinar. So it's good to be back together online again, and it's great to see how many people are joining us today. So we are very pleased and privileged to have Phyllis Bennis as our guest today. And as I wrote her recently, I believe this is the first webinar where we've had just one guest speaker. So who is this special guest that we have? Phyllis Bennis is a fellow at the Institute for Policy Studies in Washington, D.C., where she co-directs the New Internationalism Project. She is a leading voice in U.S. and global movements supporting Palestinian rights and challenging U.S. foreign policy. Phyllis serves as an international advisor to Jewish Voice for Peace, and she is a co-founder of U.S. Campaign for Palestinian Rights and is serving now on their advisory board. She has written numerous books on Palestine, the broader Middle East, U.S. foreign policy, and the United Nations. She's a frequent contributor to Democracy Now!, Al Jazeera, BBC, MSNBC, and others. And she writes widely in U.S. and international media outlets. She's served as an informal advisor on the Middle East to top UN officials, and she's twice been shortlisted to become UN Special Rapporteur on Human Rights in the Occupied Palestinian Territory. Phyllis's latest book, which came out this year, is Understanding Palestine and Israel. I'd like to read you a short portion of a review by Richard Falk. For those who don't know, Richard Falk is professor emeritus of international law at Princeton, where he taught for 40 years, and he is a former UN Special Rapporteur himself. And of her latest book, he has written, "This Invaluable Tour de Force" by Phyllis Bennis offers readers the most comprehensive, lucid, readable, and reliably informed and evidence-based guide available. While objective in its use of data and interpretive commentary, the book is impressively clear about the distinction between oppressor and oppressed. So we really are very fortunate to have Phyllis with us today, and there's a lot that we hope we're going to be able to discuss with her. So we're going to jump right into that. I think the thing that is probably in the forefront of our minds right now would be recent events like the declaration of a ceasefire that seems to have been achieved, although there's a lot of uncertainty about that. The return of Israeli hostages, Palestinian prisoners, not to mention the negotiations that happened this week in Egypt. And we are going to be touching on all of those things today, but we actually aren't going to start there. Before we do that, we're going to consider events of 2 years ago. Just a week ago, we saw the second anniversary of October 7th, which is the date of the attack on Israel by Hamas in 2023. An attack during which roughly 1,100 Israelis died, and the event that initiated the genocidal assault that Israel has wrought on Gaza over the last 2 years. So, Phyllis, I'd like to ask you to take us back to that day. How would you describe what happened on October 7th? Some have called it a day of long overdue resistance or very understandable backlash from an oppressed, horribly oppressed and punished people. And some see it only as a day of horror and a monstrous action by Hamas. So what is your perspective on those events? And please share with us anything else that you think we need to understand about that day to fully appreciate what happened.
Well, thanks very much, Bridget and Teresa, for your introductions, and to the organizations for sponsoring this, and to all of you for joining in on this today. I think it's heartening a little bit to have a lot of people that are really struggling to figure out what we should be thinking, and most importantly, what we should be doing about what is happening in the Middle East, because our own government, our own tax dollars are so central to it all. You know, the question of when you start the clock is a very key point here. We can start the clock on October 7th, but that's not when things started. Nothing really began on October 7th. You could go back 17 years before that to when it was 16 and a half, I guess, when Israel first imposed a blockade around Gaza and began controlling every bit of food, water, housing equipment, anything that went into Gaza, who could leave Gaza, who could enter, control of the airspace, control of the water, et cetera, et cetera. We could go back to 1967 when Israel first occupied the Gaza Strip. We could go back to 1948, what the Palestinians call the Nakba and the Israelis call the War of Independence, when the land, which includes Gaza, was taken and 750,000 Palestinians were expelled, dislocated, dispossessed of their land, and never allowed to return. We could start at any of those points, or obviously anywhere in between. But what happened on October 7th was all the things, I think, that you mentioned, Teresa. It was an understandable day of rage after 17 years of being in what so many have called an open-air prison, where you had a population of 2.3 million people, half of whom were under 18, who had, for 17 years, the vast majority of them had never been allowed to leave that overcrowded, tiny little strip of land. And it was also something that, according to international law, an occupied population has the right to use military force to rise up against a military occupation. That's all part of it. The other part is that the right to use military force is not an unlimited right. It does not include the right to use military force against civilians. And 2/3 of the people who were killed on October 7th inside Israel were in fact civilians. So that was illegal. That was unacceptable. the breakout of Gaza, the breaking through the wall that Israel had established. We hear a lot about the wall around the West Bank. There's also been a wall around Gaza, which was broken through on that day. That was legal. The attacks on soldiers, on military checkpoints, those were all legal acts of resistance. The attacks on civilians was not. So that's the nuance here that we rarely hear very much about. It was a day of horror, for sure, for those for those Israeli civilians who were attacked on that day in their kibbutz, in their homes, whatever it was, at the music festival. So that's, I think, the nuance with which we have to look at the events of that day. If we try and make the analogy, which is partly a good one, partly a false one, but sometimes useful, to make the analogy to 9/11, what was actually more important than 9/11, if we look at the whole world, was 9/12, the day that George Bush announced that in response to this terrible crime, he would take the world to war. And we know what the next 2 decades meant in terms of that, how many hundreds of thousands of Afghans, of Iraqis, of others were slaughtered around the world. The expansion of the US so-called global war on terror and all that it wrought in death and destruction across such a wide swath of territory. Similarly, what happened on October 7th was important. And what happened late in the day, beginning late in the day on October 7th and really concentrating on October 8th and the last 2 years since then, has been of far greater global significance when you see for the first time a genocide that has been carried out on live stream, visible to the whole world, 24/7, on our phones, on our screens, on our televisions, in our radios, on our front pages of our newspapers. The first genocide in the history of the world that was seen as it was happening. That the effort to erase Palestinian life in Gaza was visible and was being recorded and spread into the world by the very people who Israel was trying to erase. So all of that is what happened in the aftermath of October 7th. So we can't really speak of one without the other.
Thank you very much. That was really helpful to have those distinctions about the layers and the different facets of what happened on that day. And the distinction between military and civilian targets. And also making that analogy to 9/11, and just as significant as the day is what happened the next day and every day after that. That's really helpful. All right, going on a little bit more on this subject about that day and the aftermath. What so many of us in the Palestine Solidarity Movement face is meant to be a gotcha question. What about Hamas? Do you condemn them? What do you think of them? Do you agree that they are a terrible terrorist organization? And that is all that we hear about them in the mainstream media and from our government leaders. But some of us have heard that that is not the whole story of Hamas, that there's more that we need to understand. So can you help us understand a little bit more about Hamas and about their history, maybe a little bit of it at least, and what they are today,
Sure.
what you understand to be their motives, their goals?
Yeah, the Hamas is an organization that was created in 1988 at the beginning of the first Intifada. I don't know who is on this call in terms of generations. Those of you who are my generation or even a bit younger will remember that there were two Intifadas in the occupied Palestinian territory, one that began in the end of 1987 and lasted basically until the Oslo process took over in 1993, which was an extraordinary nonviolent mobilization society-wide between generations, between genders, between classes, in all those ways of opposition to occupation. And it was in the very early months of that first Intifada that Hamas emerged in Gaza. It was linked to an old region-wide organization known as the Muslim Brotherhood, which was a long-standing Islamist organization that had started in Egypt and had grown in many different places. But at the time that it emerged in Palestine, in Gaza, it was very much in the context of opposition to the Israeli occupation and to the escalating repression that was going on against the people who lived in the West Bank and Gaza and occupied East Jerusalem. And it was in that time that the Israeli government looked at this new organization and thought, these guys might be easier to deal with than the PLO, which was the main organization at that time, the main political organization. It had a number of factions within it, but the unified PLO, led by Yasser Arafat, which was a secular and nationalist organization, was seen by the Israelis as the dominant danger to their ability to control and occupy and colonize the West Bank and Gaza and East Jerusalem. So when the Palestinian branch of the Muslim Brotherhood, Hamas, emerged, the Israeli position was, maybe we should sort of encourage these guys. And they proceeded to do just that. They managed to bring a lot of money and to allow a level of organizing ability for Hamas that had never been available to the PLO. The PLO was criminalized in the occupied territories. It was even at various points during the first Intifada, it was illegal to wear the colors of the Palestinian flag. It was something kids would do as an act of great bravery, would go out in the mornings when it was still dark and climb up either a tree or a telephone pole and throw pieces of cloth in the colors of the Palestinian flag onto the lines, showing the colors of the flag, and then they would scramble down and hope they didn't get arrested and beaten, which too often happened. So Hamas emerged as an alternative to the PLO that the Israeli government viewed as more likely to be on our side, more likely to be able to be controlled. And that's what it was for many years. It played a major role in organizing in Gaza. It had an extensive social organization, both a sort of social wing that had things like summer camps for the kids, a women's organization, social assistance to the poorest people in Gaza. Gaza was already the poorest part of the occupied territory. And then it also had a political wing that negotiated with the PLO over various things, and it had a military wing that carried out various military activities. In the later part, it took on a much greater emphasis of acts of armed resistance than other parts of the Palestinian movements. It was never the only part that carried out acts of armed struggle. But for all of the movements in Palestine, like the movement in South Africa and others around the world, not all of the liberation movements, of course, but many of them, the armed actions were never the main point. They were a counterpoint to the political and social engagement that was underway, and that was true of Hamas as much as anywhere else. In the more recent periods, particularly after Oslo, when the PLO morphed into what's called the Palestinian Authority, which became essentially an arm of the Israeli effort to keep Palestinians out of Israel, prevent any kind of resistance. The acts of armed struggle on the PLO side diminished to almost nothing. Whereas for Hamas, it included those acts for quite a long time. And that led to a period in Gaza after the elections, the Palestinian elections of 2006, when the elections ended with a victory for Hamas, in a clear victory in Gaza, and in the West Bank, a victory in parts of it. The rise of Hamas at that point, because it still maintained that the legitimacy of armed actions, particularly in the context of the second Intifada, which was not a nonviolent mobilization, it was an armed exercise, and on both sides there were very heavy casualties, 30 maybe or 40 times more Palestinian casualties, of course, than Israeli casualties. But there were significant Israeli casualties, most of them military, but some civilian as well. So in all of that context, Hamas in the recent period has been seen in the context of armed actions. It has never only had an armed wing. It has always had a political wing. It has always had a social wing. It has always supported the families of Palestinians who were imprisoned by the Israeli occupation. as has the PLO and virtually every other Palestinian organization. It has supported the BDS movement, the nonviolent movement for boycotts, divestment, and sanctions against Israel, designed to bring nonviolent pressure to bear. And Hamas has, in recent years, after a long time when its charter called for an end to a Jewish state in Israel and a state for everybody instead, they changed to accept the idea of a two-state solution. That was some years ago. That's rarely acknowledged that they actually changed their charter to recognize a two-state option. Of course, that now is at a point where many of us, including me, believe that it's too late, that whatever we thought about a two-state solution, it's not really possible anymore. But I think that's sort of the history that we need to know going in. There's great books written about the history of Hamas. I'm not an expert. I haven't written one of those books, but they're accessible and they're good and useful. But just as a framework of how to look at Hamas, it's much more than its military wing.
Mm-hmm. Thank you so much. That was extremely helpful. And yes, it is so important for people to understand how much more there is that Hamas does in society and in the political arena, and as well as having the military wing. And I'm so glad you brought up, I believe it was 2017 when they changed their charter, because so few people, even those who we would expect to be informed in government or in the media, who follow these things, seem to realize that those change happened, that change in the charter happened, and it was significant. Well, I think that can bring us right up until today now, current events.
Yeah.
And specifically the ceasefire. We've seen over 67,000 killed in Gaza as of today, and the vast majority of residential structures are destroyed, as we know. I do think I can speak for all of us in saying we're relieved that some of the worst violence has abated, or so it seems, in Gaza. And we're thankful, we can all be thankful that Israeli hostages and Palestinian prisoners are being reunited with their families. But we're also seeing that thousands in Gaza who are trying to go home now from those areas they were forced to flee, they're coming back to homes that are rubble. They're coming back to neighborhoods where they have no services whatsoever or what they need to survive. And we're also hearing reports that cause us to question whether the ceasefire is in fact existing, let alone whether it will be maintained. At least dozens being killed by the Israeli military over the last few days, and humanitarian aid is not being allowed in to the degree that Israel had pledged. So, some big, very general questions for you.
Right.
What do you think we should expect from this ceasefire? What are your hopes or beliefs about it? Do you think Israel and Hamas can and will abide by it? And I will add to that, how much credit do you give Trump and his administration for the stage we've reached now? And do you think that he can continue to apply pressure and be firm with Israel?
Yeah, lots of good questions. I think it's important to start with what was signed and agreed to and what was not signed or agreed to. What was signed by Israel and Hamas was a ceasefire prisoner exchange with an agreement to resume massive amounts of humanitarian aid and a shifting deployment of Israeli troops within Gaza. That's all. This was not a peace deal. This is not a new era. I'm sorry about the sirens. We are an occupied city here in DC, and we hear them a lot these days. This is not a peace deal. This is not a new era. This does not end the Israeli occupation. It does not end Israeli control or Israeli apartheid. There is talk of a horizon towards a two-state solution, but there is nothing to make a two-state solution possible. Crucially, there is nothing that stops the unlimited flow of weapons from the United States to Israel. Today, going forward, next week, next year, for the next 10 years. There is nothing in this agreement that stops that. What was not signed was a peace deal. What was not signed was any of the massive, complicated proposals that Trump and Tony Blair and the Egyptian president and all kinds of people all over the world are talking about who's going to run Gaza, who's going to control Gaza, who's going to govern Gaza. And somehow nobody has asked a single Gazan what they think should happen. There's talk about a Palestinian technocratic committee that would run day-to-day affairs, but under the control of the so-called Gaza International something or other, I'm forgetting what it's called, which is going to be chaired by one Donald Trump, and the CEO of it, from what we know, may be Tony Blair, famous to all of us from his support for Bush's war in Iraq, known as a war criminal across the UK, and very familiar with what it takes to occupy an Arab country because he was an expert in making that happen in Iraq. None of that has been signed on to. So that's the first thing. The immediate question is, will that ceasefire hold? So far, it has mostly held in the context of the average 100 or more people per day that were being killed every day, every day, every day for the last 2 years. That's the average, is now in the tens. We had 7, I think, that were killed on Tuesday, 6 so far today. It's not an end, but the massive bombing, the use of these giant bombs has stopped. Most of the shooting has stopped, and we don't know for how long that will last. One thing that has stopped, which is important, is that while there is not the amount of aid going into Gaza that was promised and that is desperately needed, the UN says that at least 600 trucks a day is the starting point for bare survival of the population of Gaza. That's not even talking about rehabilitation of the cities or towns or the land. That's not even talking about curing the massive number of children facing malnutrition. This is talking for just those who are still alive could stay barely alive with 600 trucks. Yesterday, 300 trucks were allowed in. I haven't heard the totals for today, but Israel has said that they plan to only allow 300 a day because they say the prisoner exchange did not meet their expectations, which meant that despite the fact that they got back all 20 living hostages before a single Palestinian detainee out of the thousands that are being held in Israeli prisons, before a single one was released, all of the Israelis had been released and accounted for. That was sort of the deal. I was very worried that they might stop at that point. They didn't. They did allow most of the people who were on the list to be released, but not all of them. Among those who were not allowed to leave, many of you may have heard about Dr. Hussam Abu Safiya, who was a world-renowned pediatrician and the longtime head of the Kamal Adwan Hospital in northern Gaza. He was taken into custody in one of the many raids of the hospital. There's film that has gone all over the world, that's gone viral, of him. They called to him from an Israeli tank demanding that he come out because he had refused to send out his staff and his patients when the Israeli tanks surrounded the hospital. They demanded that he come out, and there's video taken from inside the hospital of him in his white lab coat stepping over the piles of rubble to get out to this tank and then being pulled into the tank. And that was the last anyone saw of him for several months. This was last December. After several months, finally, one of his lawyers was allowed to see him. He had been beaten badly. He had lost over 50 pounds by that time. He had been tortured. He was supposed to be on one of the lists to get out. He was not released. 19 other doctors are still being held. So not all of the prisoners that were supposed to be released have been released. Not all of the humanitarian aid that was supposed to be allowed in has been allowed in. This is not a peace deal. This is not an end even to the genocide. We thought that a ceasefire, massive humanitarian aid, and a massive prisoner exchange would at least be able to end the genocide, if not end the occupation. It is not yet, and we don't know whether it will be or not. Children are continuing to die today, this hour by hour by hour in Gaza, who are facing malnutrition that has been going on for months, because you can't cure malnutrition by one piece of bread. Your body can't absorb it, particularly children who are particularly vulnerable to malnutrition and starvation. Children who are starving can't just suddenly be provided with all the food they need and they'll be fine. They will not be fine. So the impact of this genocide continues. One of the key factors is who's in the room, who are the people making these decisions and who are not. Crucially, no Palestinians were involved in any of these documents, not the Trump 20 points, not the 6 points that were ultimately signed on to by Hamas and Israel. In fact, the original 20 points had been changed already by Israeli demands, because once they were put together, the Israeli delegation met with Witkoff, Trump's golfing buddy and real estate partner, and his son, and Trump's own son-in-law, Jared Kushner, all of whom are involved in real estate deals, getting money for their own investment firms from the Saudis, from the UAE, et cetera, across the region. And nobody seems to find that as a problem of, it's a little bit inappropriate at best, if not criminal. But that doesn't seem to be a problem. But they met with the Israelis to make sure it was all okay, and they made numerous changes, which Hamas delegations, Hamas negotiators were not even told about. They were given the final version at the same time that you and I were, when they released it publicly. That was the first time they had seen it. So the fact that no Palestinians are involved in this, and no Palestinians are being consulted by the people who are putting together these bigger plans for the day after, right? The day after, we're going to have this Palestinian technocratic committee. Who's going to choose it? Who's going to say that these Palestinians will be acceptable to anybody in Gaza? Who are they? We don't know that. Nobody knows that yet. But no Palestinians in Gaza are being consulted about who they might want in that position. They will be supervised by a political and financial supervisor, a committee, an international committee, not including Palestinians, made up of Trump and probably Tony Blair and other heads of state and whatever. And who actually runs it day to day, we don't know. Who will be able to choose them? Certainly not the Palestinians. That seems pretty clear. So all of this is being done above the heads of the entire population, who are being faced with the question of, what does it mean to rebuild in Gaza when the UN estimates there is 50 million tons of rubble that not only needs to be cleared before you can even begin to talk about rebuilding the most basic infrastructure, water, sewage. The final farewell from the Israeli troops as they were leaving Gaza, just as the ceasefire went into effect, was a separate bomb dropped on the last remaining sanitation facility in Gaza, meaning that for the coming months, maybe years, all the sewage of Gaza is going to have to be just dumped directly into the Mediterranean Sea. And that means it will wash up on the shores within hours, because there is no way to treat the sewage anymore. That was the farewell from the soldiers who had been occupying the Gaza Strip as they moved to a new part of the Strip. That was the last thing that they carried out. So this denial of agency to the Palestinians means that it's essentially a guarantee that there's going to be no end to Israeli domination, Israeli control, Israeli settler colonialism and apartheid that have characterized the siege of Gaza and the occupation of the West Bank since 1967. The level of horror might be slightly less, people can look up and see the sky and not see it blocked by bombers flying around and drones dropping bombs and who knows what else. But the notion of rebuilding all of that rubble, which now includes the bones of people's children, what do they want to happen to that rubble? Do they want to just throw it into the ocean? I can't imagine being in that position. So far, no one has asked the people of Gaza, what do you want? What will make it possible to rehabilitate your lives? We know people want to stay. What does that look like? What can it look like? No one is asking those questions. And those are the questions that, if we're talking about turning a ceasefire into a peace move, that's where you need to start. That's not the end, but that's the beginning. We're not anywhere near it yet.
Yeah. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. For so many things that you covered there, for making clear for all of us that it's not a peace deal. Everything that isn't included here, because we are hearing, some of us at least are hearing that this is a time for rejoicing, that the worst is behind us, or behind the Palestinians, behind the Gazans. Maybe it is, maybe it isn't, but there's so much missing, and not only is it missing from what's been agreed, it's missing from the focus of the world. All the things that you just made clear have not yet been settled or even agreed to. And thank you especially for bringing up the issue of Palestinian agency, and what is needed for that, how essential that is for any real solution that's going to be found for Gaza. We're a little bit behind the schedule that I had, but before we moved to the West Bank, I would like to follow up on this a little bit more, just a couple of minutes if we can, to ask you about one aspect of what all the powers that be are reiterating about the future of Gaza, that Hamas can have no role in it, that Hamas has to be eliminated. Of course, Israel claimed that was actually the goal of their war. And then they finally acknowledged that wasn't literally possible. But the idea that Hamas would have no further role in leadership in Gaza or in Palestinian society. Can you comment on that? And maybe, and this will be a longer answer, and you already said a little bit about them, but also about the Palestinian Authority and their role and their credibility in Palestinian society.
I would start with saying that right now, none of the existing leadership bodies in Palestine seem to have much credibility. Not the Palestinian Authority, not the PLO, not Hamas, none of them. They are there. They are who the world works with.
Mm-hmm.
They don't have much credibility at home. The question of Hamas's role in the future, Hamas has made clear that they're prepared to give up any role in day-to-day governance. They don't want to be in charge anymore. They never had real power. In these years of occupation, since the Palestinian elections of 2006, they didn't have power to control Gaza. They couldn't control the borders. They couldn't control who came in and who didn't. They couldn't control what came in and what wasn't allowed in, what was exported and what was not, how far out to sea the Gaza fishermen could go. They didn't control any of that. They could control how the street sweeping goes forward, maybe the times of the school sessions, those sort of municipal things, but they had no real power. The same in the West Bank. The official mandate of the Palestinian Authority, among other things, was to maintain security for Israel, for the settlers and from 48 Israel, to make sure that Palestinians in the West Bank did not threaten their security, their happiness in any way. And like the Hamas role in Gaza, they didn't have any real power. They had no power to override Israeli checkpoints that would spring up all over the place and then disappear and then reappear. They had no way to stop the building of the apartheid wall that surrounded the West Bank, but was built 85% of it inside the West Bank, so that it was stealing another 15% of the land of the West Bank, including, crucially, the 6 major water aquifers of the West Bank that provide the overwhelming majority of the water for 48 Israel, are now on the Israeli side of the wall. The Palestinian Authority had no capacity to change that, to challenge that. They had no real power. So what we're seeing now is that, in a sense, coming home to roost. They had no power. Hamas is saying, we don't want to be in charge. They are not. I mean, that's a different issue than the question of giving up weapons. They have made clear that they are prepared to decommission the offensive weapons they have, meaning rockets, those kinds of things. But they are not prepared to give up the personal weapons, rifles, whatever, that sort of thing, that they use both for controlling the streets as police, and if there should be another invasion of Palestinian land by the IDF, by the Israeli forces, they're not prepared to have given up everything that they have. That distinction between decommissioning the major weapons, which they're willing to do, and demilitarization, which means giving up all weapons, which they're not yet prepared to do, that has not yet been resolved. On the longer term, the question about 2 states, all of that debate, while many of us believe that it's way too late to have any serious expectation that anything remotely resembling a sovereign contiguous state could be built in anywhere in the occupied territory, whether in the West Bank alone, Gaza alone, the 2 of them together. There's just no land left for a sufficient viable state. But even for people who do believe that it is possible, the Egyptian president in this conference in Sharm el-Sheikh over the last 2 days, at one point had been arguing about a 2-state solution is the only way to peace, et cetera, et cetera. So on the plane coming home, Trump says to the journalist there, and I'll quote him here, he says, in response to this thing about a 2-state solution, he says, I'm talking about something very different. We're talking about rebuilding Gaza. I'm not talking about single state or double state or 2-state. A lot of people like the 1-state solution. Some people like the 2-state solution. We'll have to see. I haven't commented on that yet. At some point, I'll decide what I think is right. There you go. It's not about, oh, and then he says, I'll decide what I think is right, but I'll be in coordination with other states. Not I'll be in coordination with what the Palestinians might want. Not to speak of international law, which is in complete violation here. He's just saying, I'll make a decision at some point and I'll let you know. 1 state, 2 state, red state, blue state, Donald Trump is going to decide. So the stripping of agency, ironically, from the Israelis as well, it sounds like, but particularly from the Palestinians, whose land we're talking about, the last remnant of Palestinian land, which the Palestinians, the PLO, agreed in 1988 in an enormous concession, which was never acknowledged as such, either by Israel or by the rest of the world, when they agreed to accept the idea of Israel as a state of its own in 78% of historic Palestine, claiming for their own land only 22%. That was an enormous concession. That's never been acknowledged. But now we're talking about which scraps of the 22% are going to go where. So now it seems that 40% of the 22% is about the maximum that the Palestinians should hope for some version of a Bantustan, where they'll be allowed to post a flag, but will have no viable state, nothing that remotely resembles a state. So that's what we're talking about right now.
Thank you. That's great. Yeah, that was very helpful to understand more at the beginning of that answer about Hamas's credibility and the PAs, but also those later issues that you raised about, well, especially about Trump's way of perceiving all of this and what he thinks his role is. It seems to me sometimes Trump is helpful in that he says the quiet parts out loud, because in fact, Americans have so often quietly thought the same thing, that it's really up to us what happens over there, and it should all be done in our interests. All right. Well, I think this could help us segue to the next big topic, which would be um, looking at another occupied Palestinian territory, and which you have just mentioned, the West Bank. As you know, while so much of the world's attention, and rightly so, was fixed on Gaza and the horror that was happening there, there have been really alarming developments also in the West Bank. We've seen and I'm going to give a bit of background here for folks here because we have a wide range of people attending our webinars, some who are very knowledgeable about these issues and some who are new to them and just learning. So for the latter, what's been happening in this occupied territory? We've seen a drastic rise in violence during the 2 years of the war in Gaza. It's gotten so bad, some have called it the Gazification of the West Bank. The Israeli military has carried out multiple destructive attacks on villages, cities, refugee camps. Tens of thousands of Palestinians in the West Bank have become displaced. And the Israeli settlers have been given carte blanche to carry out vigilante attacks on at least a weekly basis, sometimes on a daily basis. Beatings, shootings, destruction of crops, destruction of entire communities have been committed by the settlers. So, and they do this with impunity and with the Israeli military watching on rather than trying to stop them in most cases. We're also seeing, on top of that, an alarming expansion of colonization plans in the West Bank. One of those is the plan to build thousands of homes for settlers in an area called E1, the letter E, the number one, E1, which stretches from East Jerusalem to across the West Bank to the largest settlement, Ma'ale Adumim. And if that area is filled in, that will effectively, as far as Palestinians are concerned, cut off the northern West Bank from the southern West Bank, which would be a further catastrophe for them. And on top of that, Israel, in the Israeli parliament, the Knesset, we've seen the Jerusalem Metropolitan Bill, which would absorb a number of major settlements into the municipality of Jerusalem itself, and they would be considered Jerusalem. As we know, Israel decades ago declared that all of Jerusalem belongs to Israel, that none of it is occupied territory, and that in fact it's the capital of Israel. And now they're proposing that a large swath of the West Bank would become Jerusalem. So with all of these plans that they have for colonization and for bizarre, frightening expansion of the borders of the municipality of Jerusalem, the word annexation is on a lot of people's lips, and it's become the focus for a lot of conversation. And I think it needs explanation before I ask you this question. A little more background for our listeners. Under international law, the West Bank, including East Jerusalem, is occupied territory. It is not part of Israel legally. The United Nations, most of the world, refers to that land as occupied Palestinian territory. Israel prefers to call it disputed territory, or sometimes Judea and Samaria, the ancient biblical names for it. But Israel has never yet dared to claim the West Bank as formally part of the state of Israel. And to do that, to actually declare that their borders have expanded and parts of the West Bank, or all of it, are now the state of Israel, that would be what we refer to as annexation. And so my question for Phyllis is, do you see formal annexation of the West Bank looming on the horizon? Do you believe that that is close to happening? If it were to happen, how serious is it in pragmatic terms? How significantly different would that be from what exists at the moment?
I think that talking about annexation is really key, and it partly because it goes to what I think is the most important question for us, which has to do with U.S. policy and what we need to be doing. So just quickly on the annexation question, because you gave a really good description of that, Teresa. I think that one of the things we need to understand is that in 2018, when Trump went to Israel during his first term, one of the things that he did was to take up the question of annexation in a very positive way. He recognized officially on behalf of the United States that the 1981 Israeli annexation of the Syrian Golan Heights, which it had occupied in 1967, and that no country had ever acknowledged, was now a legal piece of that there was Israeli sovereignty over the Golan Heights. Trump announced it. He also announced that the annexation of parts of the West Bank would be fine, and implied that the annexation of all of it wouldn't necessarily be such a bad thing either, although he didn't state that explicitly. The reality is what you just spoke to is the key point, that de facto annexation has been underway in the West Bank for a very long time. That means that the vast majority of territory, about 60% of West Bank territory, is already off limits to Palestinians. That includes all of the existing settlements and the land they claim for future expansion. It includes a wide range of military zones, a wide range of green zones that are green only for Israelis who are allowed to go there, but are completely off limits to Palestinians, ending with about 40% of the land of the West Bank in isolated pockets, non-contiguous, is the only parts of the West Bank that are still accessible at all to Palestinians, and often is closed off by checkpoints, etc. So in that context, the threat of legal claims, de jure annexation, is a real threat. It doesn't really change anything until it gets accepted by powerful countries like the United States, or if it were to be accepted by the United Nations, which is not going to happen. So that's where we stand. There is annexation underway of the West Bank. It is not legal. It's not recognized by any countries except the United States. But the United States now acknowledges or claims that moving the embassy to Jerusalem was in keeping with the right of every country to declare its own capital. The only other thing I would raise before we get to the question of U.S. policy, because that is ultimately the most important part of all this, is that in 2020, I think it was 2020, when Israel passed the so-called nation-state law, what they did was to pass what would be the equivalent here of a constitutional amendment. Israel doesn't have a constitution. It has what's called a basic law. And so changing the basic law is a very big deal. It's like a big law, kind of. Mm-hmm. So they passed a big law in the Knesset, in the parliament, that is called the nation-state law. And what it says is that the key phrase says that only Jews have the right of self-determination in the land of Israel, all of the land of Israel. And they imply that the West Bank, Gaza, East Jerusalem are all part of that, all of the land of Israel. Israel has never declared its borders. So when they talk about expanding borders, that they don't really, because they have no borders. They've never claimed borders because that would limit them. When the Zionist movement, the Yeshuv as it was called, in 1947 accepted the idea of partition, which the Palestinians were rejecting because it was completely unfair. The Yeshuv, the Jewish community in Palestine, was then about 30% of the population, owned about 7% of the land. But the UN partition plan was giving to that Jewish community 55% of the land, only 45% of it, actually a bit less, because all of Jerusalem was supposed to not be part of either state, but was supposed to be a corpus separatum, a separate body that would be under international control. That never happened. And the Palestinian state that was supposed to happen in 45% of the land also was never allowed to happen. What happened was the Yeshuv took the 55% they were offered and then a bunch more, so that by the end of that war, they now controlled 78% of the land. So in the context of that, they accepted it, but never declared their borders because they never planned to be limited to that 78%. They always planned to take more. The reason they left it open was to see how much more they could take. So the question of annexation is now a somewhat irrelevant question, because on the ground, it's already happening, and it's getting the support more and more of the Trump administration. We haven't heard his latest version of if he's going to now accept more of the West Bank and recognize Israeli sovereignty there. We don't know, but that's certainly a possibility. What that speaks to is the need for us to take very seriously that whether or not this ceasefire holds, whether or not the genocide continues because they still refuse to allow in enough food, regardless of those realities, our work has to continue to make the US stop sending arms. It's by far the most important point here. That means pressure on Congress. It means educating people about the cost to taxpayers at this moment when the government is shut down. Congress isn't even meeting. Healthcare is being cut. And we are still giving tens of billions of dollars every year now to the Israeli military to carry out this genocide right now. This is the critical factor. We're going to need to work to escalate the level of isolation in the world that Israel is now facing. Israel is incredibly isolated. The US is now incredibly isolated, but governments are afraid of what Trump will do, afraid of new tariffs, afraid of new sanctions, afraid of who knows what. But the work of the BDS movement, building a nonviolent global movement of boycotts, divestment, and sanctions campaigns, which the Methodist Church, as well as other churches, has been so central to over the years, really fighting for the church to divest in its bank accounts, in its retirement funds, from companies that are profiting from occupation, from Israeli companies and beyond, ending apartheid. All of this becomes more and more crucial as we fight for a full Israeli withdrawal of troops from Gaza. That's not happened yet. That wasn't even agreed to, but we know that needs to happen. We know that it's the US that is enabling that deployment of the Israeli military, and we're going to have to be the ones who stop it. This is going to be an incredibly difficult period because a lot of people, especially if the ceasefire holds and the necessary amounts of humanitarian aid are getting in, I think we're going to stop hearing about the urgency of genocide in Gaza, even if it continues because children are still dying of malnutrition, even if there are still 9,000 or more prisoners that are being held illegally in Israeli prisons. That's minus the 2,000 that were just released, almost 2,000. And of those, 3,000 are being held in what is known as administrative detention, meaning they've never been charged with a crime, never been charged with a violent act, never been put on trial, even in the military trials that have a conviction rate of over 99%. I think it's 99.3. No one gets put on trial in those courts and gets acquitted. And they get sentenced to life terms. So aside from those, 3,000 of them are being held without even the claim that they went through any sort of judicial process. So that's our job. It's our tax money. It's our government doing this in our name. For those of us who are Jewish, it means they're doing it in the name of Jewish safety, which is an absolute travesty, an absolute lie. And that's what we're faced with right now. So that's what I look forward to hearing in your questions is, what do we do? How do we do it? Thank you.
Yes, exactly. And that was, as you know, I think what we were going to be closing with before we went to our Q&A with our listeners. But you've addressed that to a very helpful extent already, what we need to be doing. I am actually going to ask you that once again, but I do have one other question to ask you before we come back to that. And that is looking at what other countries are doing around the world. And there are two particular aspects of what we've seen happening, hopeful aspects that we've seen happening internationally that both of which I'll raise now, and you can respond to what you think of them in whatever way you think is most helpful for us. One would be the recent wave of states recognizing the state of Palestine. Back in 1988, Yasser Arafat declared Palestine to be a country. And since then, 140 countries had recognized the state of Palestine officially, formally. But some of the major holdouts were major powers of the world that are close to the United States, such as the UK and France and Canada and Australia. And all of those I just named in the last few weeks, last month specifically, have now recognized the state of Palestine. And some have been writing about that as a cowardly act, as so little and so late. That it's almost insulting, or that it is insulting, and it is their way of avoiding doing the harder things they needed to do to stop the genocide, but also looking like they were standing with the Palestinians. Whereas others have said, actually, it does have some meaning. It wasn't a meaningful act of solidarity, and they were rebuking Israel and maybe the United States too. So one question I was going to have for you, but I am going to merge it with the other one, was, what do you think about that question of the usefulness of recognizing the state of Palestine at this point? And the other question is rather large. Other nations are in something called the Hague Group, and they are mostly countries in the global south, as they're known, specifically Bolivia, Colombia, Cuba, Honduras, Malaysia, Namibia, Senegal, and South Africa. They have committed to upholding, enforcing international law and holding Israel accountable for its actions. They support South Africa's case before the International Court of Justice, accusing Israel of genocide. They've said they would enforce the ICC court, the International Criminal Court's arrest warrants for the Prime Minister and Defense Minister of Israel. And significantly, and they've committed to an arms embargo on Israel and disrupting their supply chain. Significantly, they had, I think it was called an emergency summit in the summer in Colombia. And it wasn't just those 8 nations, over 30 nations participated in that. The special rapporteur, Francesca Albanese, called that conference the most significant political development of the past 20 months. So maybe comparing what those other world powers did with recognition to what the Hague Group is trying to do. What is your opinion of what's happening on the international scene?
Yeah, we're in an amazing moment, in fact, on the international front. The irony is, both in terms of the rise of our movement in this country and in the international situation, is incredibly powerfully better than it's been ever in my life of, too many decades. I don't want to think how long I've been working on this issue, but more than we've ever seen before. And it's had no impact yet on the positions on the ground, except to the degree of the current maybe beginning of a ceasefire, where the international situation clearly did play somewhat of a role. The issue of recognition is both too little, too late, and important, less about what it means, because it doesn't really mean much. It means that there's a genocide underway in an occupied state rather than in an occupied territory. It doesn't change anything. What it does mean is that all those countries that are close to the US and others around the world are feeling the heat of empowered movements in their own countries, demanding that people do something. And this isn't just because there's a strong Palestinian rights movement in all these places, although in many of them there is. It's also because everyone in the world now who has a cell phone, which is pretty much everyone, even in poor countries, is seeing hour by hour by hour what a genocide looks like. We're seeing children burning to death in tents. We've never seen that before. There's never been a genocide that was broadcast as it was being carried out. In 1994, in the genocide in Rwanda, people around the UN knew about it, and there were bits and pieces about it in the newspapers, but nobody saw it happening outside of that country, especially in powerful capitals. This is different. This is different. So the question of recognition is important because it shows the powerful rise of those movements, and it's too little too late to have any real impact, so let's move on. The role of the Hague Group, I certainly agree with Francesca. It is a crucially important development, particularly when South Africa and Colombia took over as the co-chairs of the Hague Group to keep it together, to broaden it and deepen it, to get more countries to sign on, more of the 30. I think 5 or 6 of the countries that were in Bogota actually did sign on afterwards. But more importantly, to move towards much greater implementation of those promises. we have essentially a menu of what countries are required to do. Right now, working to stop the genocide isn't just something that countries can choose to do or not do. It's kind of up to you. It's a requirement if they have signed the Genocide Convention, which almost every country in the world has signed onto, of course, including the United States and Israel, ironically enough. Because unlike a lot of international law, the Convention Against Genocide puts requirements on its signatories, not only on the perpetrators. It's not only something to stop it's not only something that demands that a country committing genocide stop it. It puts requirements, demands on the countries that have signed that convention to say, if there is a move towards a genocide, your obligation is to do everything possible to prevent it from becoming a full-scale genocide. And if it is a genocide, your obligation is to do everything possible to stop that genocide. So it puts that obligation. And when it went to the General Assembly, because of course it was vetoed in the Security Council, the General Assembly passed an extraordinary resolution more than a year ago. It was in September of last year, September of 2024, when it passed a resolution based not only on the preliminary decision of the International Court of Justice, which had called for a series of actions to be taken to stop what they said was possibly a genocide, plausibly a genocide already, but to stop it from becoming a full-scale genocide. And they put forward a set of requirements of what Israel needed to do and what other countries needed to do. But they also issued another ruling on the broad question of the illegality of the occupation overall. So the occupation of the West Bank, of Gaza, of East Jerusalem, and put forward a list, a menu of things that countries must do, starting with sanctions, banking sanctions, financial sanctions, trade sanctions, an arms restriction, crucially. All of those things were then brought together into this resolution passed under the Uniting for Peace precedent in the United Nations General Assembly, calling on individual states. And the crucial thing here is that this was a model that we know works. This was the model of the South African anti-apartheid movement of the 1980s, when, like today, stuff would come to the Security Council and be immediately vetoed. It would go to the General Assembly or to the International Court of Justice. And in both of them, the US would say, well, we don't care. That doesn't have the force of law. And yet, movements against South African apartheid all around the world would take these lists of requirements that the ICJ had said or that the General Assembly had said each country must do, and they started demanding it of their own countries. And eventually, one after another, including US allies, were passing resolutions imposing sanctions, cutting off trade, cutting off arms, saying that they wouldn't allow the transfer of arms. All of that. And eventually, the US became so isolated that it gave in and allowed the anti-apartheid movement of the United States, led in the Black community by the Black Caucus of the Congress and the Black churches, let them win and impose sanctions on apartheid South Africa, which helped set the stage for what the South African people were already doing to move against apartheid as a whole. That's what we need to be doing now. So the role of the Hague Group is an example of how those kinds of pressure points come to bear. The example of the BDS movement all around the world, putting pressure on all these governments. The fact that countries like France, like Italy, like Spain, like Australia, like Canada, are now recognizing Palestine as a state isn't important because that changes what happens on the ground in Palestine. It changes because it starts to isolate the US refusal to acknowledge these realities and to acknowledge international law. So what we're seeing now is an effort to reclaim international law from the US effort to simply diminish it with this genocide in Gaza, where instead we have, a situation where the US was already sort of putting aside international law, saying there's no such thing as international law. We have the international rules-based order instead. You say, well, what's that? Where's that written up? Well, it's not written up. It's whatever we say is the rules-based order. And that's where we are right now. But right now, we're going back even further than that, away from international law. President Trump is out there acting like, we might say, like a mafia don, ordering when international law, which international law, how international law will or will not be imposed.
Mhm.
So we have a lot of work to do to reclaim international law in this context, and this gives us the opportunity to do that. It's our movements that become the enforcement of international law. When the ICJ doesn't have an enforcement arm, the General Assembly doesn't have an enforcement arm, but social movements, faith-based and otherwise, have the capacity to act as the enforcers of international law.
That's a fantastic note on which to conclude conclude that answer. And I think to conclude the questions that I personally had for you, it's a combination of a grim reality of what the United States is doing with what I heard was truly a hopeful message about the power of those nations' societies to influence what their leaders are willing to do. And in some countries more than others, but obviously there is that soft power is being felt in the halls of power in a number of parts of the world. So I'm going to segue now. But we've already heard from you quite a few statements about what we need to be doing and how important the BDS movement is, how important it is to isolate Israel, and that it already is becoming that, but it must continue to call out apartheid and take steps to end the apartheid regime. And I want to take a look, and I have taken a look at the questions that have been piling up from our listeners. As you can imagine, there are quite a lot now. And a number of them do focus similarly on wanting to know what we can do. And I would like to combine two in one question again, as I've been doing. So one of them is asking for information, and it would lead into what can we do about this. Someone asked if you could give an overview of why the U.S. has historically supported Israel with money and weapons. And no, you can't do that.
I can, but I'm not going to do it because it takes too long, and we need to be talking about what we're doing.
Well, and the next
I will say
question
people can
was
read my
the next
book,
question
and
was
there
going to
is-
be what can we do to turn that around?
Okay,
What
that's what
can we do to change that? Yeah.
Right, that's the key question. I would urge people to try and read my book. There is
Yeah.
a number of sections. It's done as FAQs. It's a number of sections that take up the question of the history of the so-called special relationship. But I think the question is now what we're doing. Things like the campaign against shipping. There's been a big BDS campaign against Maersk, shipping company, which is one of those ones that most people in this country have really never heard of unless you, I guess, I don't even know if they do like cruise ships, but they're a giant shipping line that ships stuff all over the world.
Mhm.
For us, the issue is stopping sending the weapons. There's also on a global level things like the campaign against Maersk to prevent weapons and things like fuel that produce weapons. So coal is being stopped in Colombia. They were shipping a lot of coal to Israel. They were one of the top suppliers of coal. They no longer will ship coal to Israel. The companies, the factories that build some of this surveillance equipment, some of the drones that Israel makes, are powered by coal. They no longer are getting Colombian coal. There's a move afoot in South Africa to follow that. They haven't quite gotten the laws in place yet to do it, but they're trying. For us, it's more direct. For us, it's the actual weapons. And there's both short-term and longer-term moves to do this. There was just a move in Congress for another. I'm forgetting the acronym. There's an acronym for
JRD, the JRD.
Yeah, the JRDs, a joint resolution of
Disapproval.
disapproval. Thank you. I always forget that one. The joint resolutions of disapproval in Congress, which targets specific weapon systems and says, this is not okay. We don't approve. We don't approve sending any 2,000 or 5,000 pound bombs to Israel because they are being used against civilians. They are not in a war with another country where they need those weapons. They, of course, yes, used those weapons against Iran, again, illegally, with US support. The US also dropped them. But we can and must do this again. It also means linking the work that we do about arms to Israel with the broader movements against using weapons all around the world. What we know now of what the Trump administration is doing off the coast of Venezuela, blowing up boats with the spurious claim, no evidence ever being produced, that these boats are full of, this is also a what if, an even if moment, claiming that these boats are filled with drugs and narco terrorists, without ever identifying a single person among the 27 that the US has killed so far. There was another boat attacked yesterday. Colombia says at least one of the boats was actually a Colombian boat, not a Venezuelan boat at all. They're all in international waters, not in Colombian waters. And there has been no move by the United States government to acknowledge any evidence of who they are, what they're carrying, and even if they were committing a crime, even if these were drug runners, which some of them may well be, there is no law, no US law and no international law that authorizes extrajudicial execution. This is murder. This is not crime fighting. This is murder on the high seas. So we need to be part of those movements. There was a move in the Senate the other day, and we came so close to getting rid of the authorizations for the use of military force from 1999 and 2002, not the crucial one of 2001 after 9/11, which has been used to justify all kinds of war moves by all kinds of presidents, from George Bush to Barack Obama to Donald Trump to Joe Biden, back to Donald Trump. But at least the other two, and it lost 51 to 49. It was a 50 to, I'm forgetting, within one vote. It was very, very close. But we need to be part of that movement as well. But in the context of Israel, the fact that last year we spent $22 billion on the Israeli military with no restrictions, that violates 5 separate US laws. And your members of Congress need to keep hearing that that's not okay. That's not what our tax money is supposed to go for. Somehow we have enough money to send to the Israeli military to kill children in Gaza, and we don't even have enough money to maintain the healthcare subsidies that are going to lead, when they're stripped, to millions of people across this country losing their healthcare altogether. That's not okay. Those are the links that we need to be making with all the work that we do.
Thank you. That's great. I posted in the chat myself a link for our action to contact U.S. leaders to stop arming Israel. So that's something people could do at this moment. It only takes a few clicks. And some of what you spoke about raised, it connected to other questions that we had about what's happening in domestic U.S. politics. The fact that in the Democratic Party, we've seen poll after poll that suggests a large majority now want a serious change in policy toward Israel and a restriction of arms to Israel. And yet much of the leadership isn't listening yet. However, we are seeing more sponsors on the Block the Bombs Act than we ever would have seen on anything like that.
Sponsors on that. We have a number of polls, and I think part of the reason that leadership is not paying attention to them is because not enough of us are bringing those polls to our members. Not the whole poll, because they're not going to read it, but pick out the 2 or 3 things. The New York Times poll about 2 weeks ago, the subhead was, "A majority of American voters now oppose sending additional economic and military aid to Israel, a stunning reversal in public opinion since the October 7th attacks." And in that poll, it said that 51% of all voters, more than half, oppose more aid to Israel. There was an adjoining poll, and in that poll also, 62% of all voters said Israel is not taking enough precautions to protect civilians, and 40% of all voters said Israel is intentionally killing civilians. In a parallel poll by the Quinnipiac polling outfit, 75% of Democrats and 66% of independents, and even 37% of Republicans are opposed to sending more aid. For those of you who live in blue states, where people are still afraid to think about criticizing Israel, it's political suicide, oh, what about AIPAC, blah, blah, blah. Don't let them get away with that. Push this in their face. This poll that says 75% of Democrats want no more aid to Israel. And then for those who are concerned about the Jewish community, the Washington Post just had a new poll, also about 2 weeks ago, saying, the jump head said, most US Jews say Israel is committing war crimes. 39% say it's genocide. 61% of American Jewish voters are saying Israel is committing war crimes. 50% of younger Jews say it's genocide. That's huge. In all my years of working on this issue, we've never seen numbers like this. So members of Congress will tell you, well, we don't even know about those polls. What polls are these? Show it to them. Bring the paper in and bring them a one page. They won't read more than a page. Bring them the one page, big type, with these numbers on it. 75% of Democrats say no more aid to Israel. 39% of Jews say Israel is committing genocide. This is huge. They don't have answers for this. The only answer is to stop sending aid to Israel, because those arms are what enable the genocide to continue. That's our job.
Thank you. That's perfect. I love that idea of just bringing them the statistics and challenging them to do what those are obviously telling them to do, what the American people are clearly telling them to do. And I'm ready to rewrite our action alert now with the statistics. So thanks for that. Very practical advice on getting change to happen in the U.S. government. I think we're going to have to wrap it up now. And I know there were other questions people were hoping we could bring to you, but we've covered a lot of ground. And we are really grateful for the time you brought to us and the expertise and the insights, the knowledge that you have of what's happening there. So I am now going to turn this back over to Bridget, who will close us out. And thank you again, Phyllis.
Hi, everyone. Thank you again so much for joining us. Thank you again for our speaker. You will be emailed a recording of this webinar. Information about how to access the recording will be sent out. You can also access it on our YouTube channels. That information was shared earlier in the chat and also on our websites. Information on our next webinar will be shared as the details of that become clear. So please be on the lookout as we continue this conversation. Again, please continue to share these recordings with people in your networks and with people in your communities. Thank you again, and I hope you will join us next time.